You're listening to Latinx Therapy. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional and is not a substitute for psychological diagnoses or treatment. I'm your host, Adriana Alejandre, licensed marriage and family therapist. Hey, welcome to our first topic in sesión número 2. Right off the bat, I'm going to let you all know that this topic may be a little triggering to some. In this sesión, Maritza, Plascencia, LCSW, and I discuss the symbolic meaning of la chancla and discuss the effects of what it truly is, child abuse, a formerly widely normalized method of punishment in our Latinx community. We explore the generational differences of la chancla, the use of it in schools, when discipline crosses the line, why it is used, what people can do instead, and we answer some questions such as reporting abuse. I will provide you all with some resources after the episode. Here's a little bit about Maritza. Maritza Plascencia obtained her master's degree in marital and family therapy from the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant International University in Irvine, California. She began her training as a therapist in 2009 at a community clinic serving the homeless and other underserved individuals and families in Orange County. After graduating, she went on to work at a local domestic violence agency for 5 years. Prior to pursuing her master's degree, Maritza had interned at the Orange County Public Defender's Office in the Juvenile Division, interviewing minors in custody in preparation for their defense, and later moving on to work as a victim advocate, specifically to support victims of domestic violence and their children in criminal court. Maritza is certified as a domestic violence and a sexual assault counselor, as well as trained in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, EMDR for short. Maritza is currently in private practice in Tustin, California as a solo practitioner at Mindful Quest Relationship Counseling. Maritza was raised in a Mexican home where mental health was an indirect and ongoing topic of conversation, as her father would always refer to psychology to explain why some family members exhibited certain behaviors or why certain situations would be created, and her mother always had El Show de Cristina playing on TV. Alright, so that's a little bit about Maritza. Here we go into the interview, which is a little bit lengthy because of the nature of the content. Are you ready for this?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about when la chancla crosses the line. And let's just jump right into it because we have so much to cover and we're not even going to be able to cover it all. Let's go into the evolution, which is so interesting. What have you noticed to be the generational differences of la chancla? So the evolution of la chancla itself.
Well, it seems that with older generations, la chancla was a form of controlling the children, of keeping the children in line. Back in the day, people had less education and, well, I don't believe, I know just from personal experience and hearing stories from older people in my family or even people who grew up getting this method of discipline. And I know that it was a very effective form of controlling cattle. And so I think it automatically translated to people using this to control their children, because for a long time, little children weren't seen as necessarily knowing any better. It kind of put children in a very similar category as driving cattle around. And so that's why it was seen as appropriate to use with children, not because people in those older generations were necessarily trying to be cruel. They were just trying to be good at guiding their children. It was well-intentioned, but over the years with younger generations, for example, that I think would apply more to like my grandparents' generation. With, say, my parents' generation, and I'm 35, so just so the audience can get a little bit of an idea of my point of view, my parents' generation, it was more, this is what we do because this is what we were taught, and we don't know any better than to do this. And so it kind of evolved from being, this is what's best, to it's because we don't know any better. When you have that transition, some people started questioning, is this truly the best thing to do for our children? I can personally say that between my parents, I remember hearing discussions where they felt like this was the best way to discipline versus the other parent saying, this is not what we should be resorting to. There's got to be a better way. Mm-hmm. I remember also my dad sharing a story long time ago when I was still a kid. I remember him sharing a story about how in his pueblo where he grew up in the state of Jalisco, he shared that if any kid was caught doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing or misbehaving in some way, or even being disrespectful to an elder, someone in the pueblo would discipline that child. Or if they caught that child misbehaving along with their child, they would discipline the child and then make sure to take the child back to their home and hand them off to the parents saying, here you go, I disciplined your kid, he did this and this, and now it's your turn to make sure this doesn't happen again. So oftentimes, my dad said in the story that oftentimes the parent would then rediscipline the child with, again, hitting them once again. The child would get, you can say, a double dose of punishment with, la chancla. And it could have been, I remember my dad saying that it was very common to use, I forget what they're called, but the things they use to hit the horses.
Oh, yeah, the whips.
The whips, yes. It kind of went from that older generation being very open to having the village. I think this is where the concept of the village raises a child comes from. That older generation feeling like it's okay to have someone in your community come and discipline your child. Mm-hmm. And again, I think it comes from that mentality of we're all in this together. If my cow strays, my neighbor sees my cow is marked, bring it back to me. Make sure you redirect that cow where it belongs to. It kind of goes back to that mentality.
It takes a village. It's accepted in the schools. If we're speaking about just the generational differences and the evolution, the parents, I remember, would tell the teachers, it's okay for you to give him one if he misbehaves, because it was here in the US. They wouldn't do that. But yes, you're right. Like it was that mentality then. I know for sure that my parents at least do not have that mentality anymore.
Yeah. Right. And so that's, I think, where, again, the transition goes into this, newer generation of our parents, where our parents now, questioning this method of raising children, also started setting more boundaries around it. It's not that we're now okay for anybody to just come and discipline our children. I think we have to keep in mind the fact that, at least here in the United States, a lot of the families that brought this customary way of raising children or disciplining children were also immigrating here. And so a lot of them didn't necessarily have the same community that they came from.
Yeah.
Now it was a more diverse community. So that also contributed to, I'm not going to just have some stranger versus someone who I've known my whole life discipline my children, right? Because I don't really know their intentions. I don't really necessarily have the level of trust that maybe I had back in the village or the pueblo I come from.
Yeah.
That also came with the evolution, the fact that a lot of the Latino families here in the United States are immigrants from Mexico or other parts of Latin America.
Yeah.
And so that's why there's been more boundaries around that. And then I bring it to our present generation. There's a lot less inclination to use this approach. Mm-hmm. And for people that are still using this approach, I think there's a lot of conflict, a lot of internal conflict for parents. I've spoken to parents where they've shared that they prayed about it, or that they've looked for the answer in the Bible, for example. For people that are not necessarily religious but are more highly educated, they resort to reading books about parenting and different approaches to parenting because they're really looking for answers to try and stay away from that approach of disciplining, because when our generation experienced this and recognized it as something that, while it can be funny, it can also be very damaging. We have a lot more self-awareness in our generation, I think, about how it impacts our relationships growing up and even our sense of self.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's the perpetuating cycle of the system. But, you're saying that the people that immigrated here, maybe in the 80s and 90s, they are obviously older now and are realizing that there are other forms. There's more resources. Because I know when I was young, 80s, 90s, I won't date myself yet, but back then, the child abuse laws were still being created. I think they were existing, but they were so floozy. Like, social workers wouldn't necessarily come out unless it was severe back then. One thing that is also continuing the cycle of La Chancla being normal is that in the US, there's still many states that accept corporal punishment as a method of discipline. Still now, present day, which is mind-boggling. We actually didn't know that until Maritza and I did research on this.
Yeah. And so that knowing what we know in the mental health field and all the research that's been done, that to me, that's very disturbing that we have still states that are allowing this. But yeah, I have to go back to what you were saying about growing up in the 80s and the 90s. Even you bringing that up right now, it reminds me of getting the talk from my parents because they heard about somebody's kid calling, 911 or telling a teacher about them getting hit at home. And then Child Protective Services, or CPS, as some people might know it, they came to the home and one of the parents got arrested for hitting the child, for disciplining the child. And I remember getting this talk about, you better not tell, because otherwise you're going to be taken away. And I look back to it and it makes me laugh to remember that I know my dad was the one who gave us the talk, and my dad was not necessarily the one who was using this approach and disciplining. My dad was the one that was more against it. His fear of us saying anything and then my mom being taken away. Can you imagine this man left with, at the time it was just 3 kids, we're 5 in total. Mm-hmm. But can you imagine, the fear of this man who was going to be left with 3 kids and probably go crazy trying to keep him in line while his wife was in jail? My dad said, you better not tell, because if your mom or I get arrested, when I come out of jail, I'm going to make sure to give it to you twice as hard. And I remember that really stuck with me and my brothers. I think with my brothers too, because they never threatened to call 911 or tell a teacher. I definitely did. And I think that's why the talk was given. Yeah,
some kids are more open about that and know that you have to go beyond the fear. But unfortunately, so many kids listen to the fear, listen to the threats. I do remember having friends that had those similar talks and wouldn't say anything because everything had to be kept inside the family.
Yes.
We fix it here with the family, no outside help was the mentality. I know that it still is presently in some homes, but in many, it's not, thankfully. It's more than minority now. And before we get into when it actually crosses the line, well, I know you had an example of something that happened to you in the 4th grade.
Right, yes. So in the 4th grade, I had this teacher that up until this point where, this incident happened, I actually really liked, and I really, really looked up to her. And one of the things that happened is we were doing our reading time. I think they would make us read for 30 minutes. And it was, supposed to be silent so that everyone could concentrate on the book of their choice. And somebody at my table, I think they were whispering or something along the lines. And as a teacher would walk around the room reading her big, thick book, she walked past my table and I guess thought that I was the one talking. Mm-hmm. So I remember just being really shocked when I felt the weight of her heavy book on the top of my head. She actually smacked me with her book.
Wow.
I was in such shock. I remember that it took a little while for me to really process and understand what had just happened. Mm-hmm. And I remember at some point I just started crying because I couldn't believe that this person, that I had so much respect for, that I really looked up to, that I really liked, had just done this to me. It was a big disappointment for me. And so I remember that I went home that day, and my feelings were so hurt that I went home and I kept thinking about it. And I think my mom noticed something was wrong, because I remember her asking me what happened, if everything was okay.
Yeah.
And I believe mothers have a really special way of being connected with their kids and really, sensing when something is off.
Yeah.
And so my mom, asked me, and I ended up telling her what happened at school that day. And so my mom, and this is where you and we were talking about that mama bear syndrome.
Yep.
My mom, like a true mama bear, and also going back to that whole, setting boundaries around who's allowed to discipline our children in that generation. My mom went to school the next day and made it very clear. She was very stern about it. And I'm talking about my mom, a little short lady who spoke no English, going up to my, Caucasian teacher who spoke no Spanish, who was like super tall. I would imagine intimidating to her at that time. My mom just went up to her, came up to the classroom and just made it very clear, you do not hit my child. And I will report you to the principal's office. And if I hear of this again, then you're going to have to deal with me. And it's not going to be this pretty, or it's not going to be this nice. There was definitely a threat in my mom's voice and the way that she handled that situation. And I remember after that teacher was especially nice to me. But at that time, after the incident, the trust was definitely broken for me. I did not trust the teacher. I did not feel safe around her. I just, was very cautious about not even doing things that could be taken the wrong way or perceived as if I was not following the rules around her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in you talking about it right now, it actually gave me a flashback to kindergarten when it was reading time, and my teacher, Miss Quinn, she actually grabbed my index finger, the one I was using to follow the words, and she picked it up and shoved it down because I wasn't getting the words properly. I remember that also stuck with me. And I was always a quiet child, but I guess I was extra quiet that evening, that my older sister, at the time my parents were working, they had their own business. And my oldest sister, Jasmine, she would actually take care of us. She was probably in the 6th grade when I was in kindergarten. And she came over. She had that mama bear syndrome. Mm-hmm. And she talked to the teacher and told her that was not okay. And she made it very clear, just as you're saying. And it just, now as a mental health professional, it makes me reflect back on the self-care of those teachers. Like they were frustrated for whatever reason, but they took it out on us. And I'm sure we're not the only ones. Maybe people listening also have many more experiences, and it needs to be talked about.
Definitely.
It doesn't just happen at home, but it happens at school. And even though it's subtle, like mine, like, I'm sure she didn't mean for anyone to see, but I definitely saw. I remember it. It still stuck with me. So talking about it is very healing, I think. Well, I guess we'll jump into this right now. When does discipline cross the line to abuse?
There's different ways to looking at this. One of the things that for me that I've learned as a mental health professional and having worked with kids, I used to work in a domestic violence agency, and just having seen a lot of these situations where kids were being either exposed to domestic violence or even directly being disciplined in very harsh ways. I think that if we're talking specifically about like Chancla or that, using corporal punishment with other, tools other than the Chancla, the point that, or the guidelines that are set for us in most places where this is something considered to be child abuse is when it leaves a mark, when it causes an injury. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it at that point, us as mandated reporters, therapists, teachers, any person that works with children as mandated reporters, we know at that point that we need to report. But I think that being someone who works with the emotional aspect of, the effects of being disciplined in this manner, and having worked with so many children and really seeing the emotional effects it can have on children, for me personally and professionally, it crosses a line once the child is living in fear, once the child no longer feels safe and the child doesn't really feel like they have the freedom to be a child anymore. So to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. If a child all of a sudden starts acting more mature than they truly are, just because they're trying to really avoid being disciplined in this way, or becomes really quiet when they used to not be that way, that those are signs when we can definitely point to and say, this is where it's crossing the line into abuse, because we're definitely stripping the child from that emotional safe that they should have, with whether in the home or at school or any other place where they spend time.
Legally, in every state, the laws may be different.
Yes.
Typically, it is when a mark is left, when an injury occurs as a result. You were talking about, also your personal beliefs as to when it also crosses the line emotionally and somewhat psychologically. To add to that, La Chancla and whatever other method or tool, like you were saying, that is used, it crosses the line when it's a reaction to your own feelings, not to the child's actions.
Yes.
So when you're frustrated because of personal reasons that has nothing to do with your child and their actions developmentally, then that's when you're crossing your own line. That's when it's not about the kid anymore. It's about you.
I think, just to add to that, to what you just said, I definitely agree with that. Another component of that is also when the punishment doesn't necessarily match the behavior.
That's right.
An example that comes to mind is I accidentally dropped a glass of milk and the glass broke and the milk spilled all over the place. That's an accident. That's something that it could happen to any child. It can also happen to any adult. Mm-hmm. But if the parent is trying to discipline the child for having made a mistake, for accidentally having knocked over a glass of milk, whether they're doing it out of a reactionary state because of their own frustrations or not, that in itself is another way that it crosses the line. The way that you're disciplining doesn't necessarily match or is not congruent with the behavior that you're trying to discipline.
Yeah. And regardless of any behavior of anyone at any age, really, violence, corporal punishment is just not the answer at all. There are other ways. Communication is key. Love is key. The connection. We always have to resort back to that. And I'll have a separate episode to specify on what I mean about that. But, I would definitely be interested, if you're listening, to know what your thoughts are about this topic up to this point right now. So, Maritza, what are common reactions after being hit?
Well, before I answer that, can I just say something?
Yeah.
So just to add to what we just spoke about, that answer about when it crosses the line, it's more for people that do believe that it's okay to use this, that still currently believe it's okay to use this. But I want to make sure that there's a separation. Just like you said right now, corporal punishment is not necessarily the best approach. I want to make it very clear that as a mental health professional, it's not something that I personally endorse. I've worked with a lot of people that were brought up in that way. I myself was brought up in that way. This kind of goes into the next question.
Yeah. So what are common reactions after being hit? After someone gets la chancla, el chanclazo, el cinto? What are some common reactions?
Some common reactions that people have reported having, and people that I've worked with, after so many times, they learned to just kind of check out being hit. And so what that's done to people that learned that or kind of use that defense mechanism, which as a mental health professional, we know that goes into dissociation.
Yeah, that's a clinical term.
It's a clinical term, and your mind goes blank or your mind goes somewhere else. It's almost as if you're not really experiencing, you're not present in the experience of what's happening to you in that moment. So what that does for some people is it's okay that we all have this defense mechanism. It comes in really handy whenever we need to use it. It's a great thing that we're equipped with as human beings. However, when we use it time and time again, when we make chronic use of this defense mechanism, that's when it can become a problem. And so I've worked with adults who, because they got disciplined so much with La Chancla, because they got hit on a regular basis, and maybe it wasn't just like, once a week or once in a while, it was maybe on a daily basis. Maybe it was multiple times on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so those people from an early age, you can say, conditioned themselves to check out. And so as adults, they really struggle being present. They really struggle being able to focus in what they're doing, in experiencing the moment. And a lot of them feel like something's wrong with them, when in reality, this is just something that they've been conditioned, or you can say it's been a result from having been raised this way. It's an effect that being hit by La Chancla had on them. So that's one of the effects that can result from that. Another one is that a lot of the times when we're children, and I think this is common, when we're children, we tend to internalize everything and anything that goes on around us as it must say something about me, or I must have done something wrong.
Yeah.
And so for kids getting hit by La Chancla, it can be so devastating. It can mean their world crumbles. I remember feeling like, oh my goodness, I must be a very terrible person because I can't get things right, or I can't just know exactly what is expected of me. Yeah. And so it brings on this big sense of responsibility that really doesn't belong to the child. And that's another common response when kids are hit that they can have, is that they internalize it as something must be wrong with them.
Right. And then I know that in addition, the child then feels that they're confused in the moment, but then afterwards they have that strong urge and desire to just reconnect with the parent, do everything that they want right. And if this pattern keeps continuing where they're being hit and then, they have to reconnect, reattach, it does in the long run create attachment problems in relationships.
Yeah. And so it kind of goes into, why does domestic violence happen in relationships? In adult intimate relationships, right? Kind of sets up the children for associating a relationship where they're supposed to be cared for, where they're supposed to be loved, with this is okay. This is okay when I fall out of line, when the other person perceives my behavior as being inappropriate, for them to come and discipline me and let me know by disciplining me with corporal punishment that this is not okay. And so it can set up the children to then grow up to either become, I'm going to put quotations around this, who then loves, quote unquote, loves in this way, and goes around finding a partner that is okay with being loved in this way, by then, feeling like I need to put you back in line, make you fall into place if I perceive you doing something that goes against the relationship. And so it can set up children to become abusive, or it can also set up children to become abused when they're adults by their partners.
Yeah, our children are our mirrors, and anything that you're doing to cope with your stressors is how they are going to most likely follow along.
Yes.
I know that also in high school, I would recall some of my friends saying that they're going to get La Chancla anyway, so they might as well misbehave because that notion of they're already quote unquote bad, already bad children. They might as well ditch because they're going to get hit anyway.
Yeah.
It's like setting them up for failure, essentially, using punishment like this versus communication.
Yeah.
It's just having a dialogue about their actions and how it's actually misbehaving, what that actually means value-wise in that household.
Yes. So in the long run, it really disempowers the parents. In the long run, the parents don't realize that they're setting themselves up for, at some point, not really being able to have the control that they so much crave over their children. And I want to back up a little, and I want to say that a lot of the time parents, and I've heard this so many times from parents that I've worked with, or even just in my own family growing up, I remember being told, I hit you because I love you. Because for some kids, automatically that just doesn't make sense, right? It just doesn't match. It's almost like a math problem that just doesn't work out. Like, what do you mean 0 plus 0? Like, it just doesn't go. And so it kind of sets up some of the kids to do just what you just said, you know, like, well, I'm going to get hit anyway. Like, supposedly that's what my parents do to love. So I might as well just do whatever the heck I want.
Yeah.
You know? And so because of that, a lot of the times the parents end up really losing the control over the children probably earlier than they expect control of other children.
And that's also where the evolution of the symbolic chancla comes into play, because I know that when the kids get older, the parents begin to lose that control that you're talking about. So la chancla then becomes like harsher forms of punishment, like a broomstick,
yes,
la escoba, mugs, anything that's harder in order for that parent to attempt to regain control when they're just causing more physical harm to their older teen. And at this point, usually teens sometimes laugh after being hit. They end up laughing, and ultimately that's a defense mechanism. That's another common reaction.
You know, in preparation for this, I mentioned to my parents that I was going to be doing this talk with you. And we were kind of just thinking back of what the experience was. And we had moments where it kind of got awkward, because I know my parents struggle with the guilt of having raised predominantly the 3 oldest children this way. The last 2 children were babied and pampered in ways that we never were. But, you know, one of the things that we brought up, or I don't remember who brought it up, but one of us brought up, was that when my mom used to come and resort to using the wet belt, because that was my mom's chancla. My mom used to wet one of my dad's leather belt.
Wow.
And because that was going to be more painful than an actual chancla. I remember my mom coming and me telling myself, there's no way I'm going to give her the pleasure of seeing her let me cry, or make me cry, rather.
Right.
And I remember I used to like mentally prepare for, she's going to cry before I do, out of frustration that she can't get me to cry. There was kind of like, oh my goodness, I didn't know you were this vicious child who wanted to make me cry. But at the same time, it's like, well, at some point, like you're saying, the children get old enough where they say enough is enough.
Yeah.
They start rebelling against the parent. And so sure enough, it became so effective for me to just bite my bottom lip, get hit, and it would burn, you know, whenever I would get hit. But I remember that I knew that if my mom hit me 2 or 3 times, she was going to be the one that was going to run off crying, because she was going to be so frustrated that I was so out of control. When in reality, I knew that I wasn't out of control. I knew that I'm not a bad kid. I'm not really doing things that are as bad as maybe some other kids are doing. It was more like, oh, I'm not wanting to do my chores right this minute, you know?
Yeah.
And so even when the kid is not necessarily someone who's out doing drugs or sneaking out and having sex or doing all these really self-destructive things that they could be doing, I think even for the kids that are, you know, a little less dysfunctional, I'm going to put it that way, even for those kids, there comes a time where they rebel and they say enough is enough. They start standing up for themselves in ways that maybe the parents don't understand. And then they just see it as an escalation of the misbehavior.
Yeah. And overall, like the common reactions can also include that depression. For some teens or younger children, it's suicidal ideations, thinking that they can't be loved. It could be more, you mentioned actually this one, the hypervigilance, that you guys had better reflexes.
Oh, yeah.
In your home.
Yeah. So yeah, it can be that. It can be knowing when the chancla's coming unexpectedly and you know how to dodge, where, you know, in which direction to dodge. I mean, again, that's something that we think of and we talk about, and it's something funny to us now, but it's true. It creates this hypervigilance of, I'm going to expect that at all times, something is going to come to hurt me. I'm going to start. And so that kind of sets us up for growing up and in our relationships, looking for, I think I read something, I don't know if it was you or someone else who posted something about this recently on social media. It sets us up for looking out for ways that we're going to get hurt in relationships. And so I think that automatically it, even though it may be something physical that we're looking out for, we're looking out to protect ourselves physically from some chancla flying across the room, it still nonetheless conditions our brain to be looking out for threats.
Yeah.
This is someone that is supposed to be safe. This is my parent or my parents who are supposed to be the people that love me the most in this world, that have the most unconditional level of love. Yet here are these people that are the same people, unexpectedly at times, throwing objects across the room at me. And so it kind of sets us up for us to just expect that from anybody.
Yeah, my body right now went back into time and my heart started to palpitate a little bit more as you're speaking, because it brought me back to that, I guess, paranoia. I wasn't hit, like I mentioned, in my family, but my other siblings were. And so I was always waiting for that day when it would come. It never came, but I lived in fear.
Mm-hmm.
So those are definitely also common reactions. Even if parents are not hitting someone directly, it can still impact them in different ways. If they're hitting another child or someone else, there are definitely side effects all over to violence.
Yes.
Different kinds. We can have like 10 segments about this, I'm sure, or more.
Yes. One of the things I wanted to also highlight is the fact that I have worked with kids, and I remember I myself used to experience this, where there were days where it was really overwhelming getting disciplined in this way. And it could have been over, like I said earlier, over me not wanting to do chores. And sometimes it was because I had too much homework to do. And so there were times when I remember feeling like I should just try running away. And so that thought would cross my mind. I never did run away, thank goodness. But, it goes back to kids that run away. There are a lot of kids that run away and that maybe don't come back and then end up facing a very harsh world all on their own.
Yeah.
Because there's no safety in the home. And then that's when it kind of sets them up for even more of a difficult life at an earlier age. So there's definitely that risk factor. And there's also I want to call it the covert runaways. Having worked with the domestic violence population, I remember time and time again hearing stories of I was hit at home, and because of that, I ended up just finding a way that would be legitimate for me to leave my home at an early age. And so I got pregnant at 16, at 17, and not really necessarily knowing the partner I was getting pregnant with, but just because I knew that if I got pregnant, my parents would say, you need to go live with him now. You need to go marry this person now. And that would be my ticket out the door. And so that kind of sets kids up also for teen pregnancy. We already are very complex as human beings, and already life is hard as it is. By using this form of discipline, we are just making life harder for the children to face life as adults, because so many of the things that we mentioned, as well as things that we didn't even get into, can happen for them as adults. One last thing is that when we don't have that emotional safety in the home and something is happening to the child, whether it's outside of the home or even within the home with other family members, that is not supposed to be happening, it makes it less likely that the children are going to feel safe to come to the parent and ask for help, out of fear that they're going to get disciplined, that they're going to get blamed. And so it really even sets up the children and the parents to not have that kind of open communication. So professionally, I think that it's necessary to look for ways to create that safety in the home, so that no matter what the children face outside of the home or even within the home with other adults that are not necessarily the parents, that they're able to come to their safe base, which is the parents.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
So personally, I think that having been a child raised in the 80s and 90s, being disciplined with La Chancla, goes back to what I was saying, is it gave me more things to work on in my own therapy. But then again, there's people that don't necessarily go into therapy because of this message of don't tell. This is something you keep within the family. And so it creates a big barrier for us to be able to work on ourselves. when we're raised in this way. It creates this fear of really allowing ourselves to be seen by others that are close to us or by the world around us. Personally, that's my biggest issue with it. It strips us from the voice and the identity that we are born with.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that it takes away the voice. So it creates confusion to all sections of your life. It perpetuates, it continues the cycle of violence. It's a learned behavior, so the cycle is going to continue. Like you mentioned, it hurts relationships because it truly is not an act of love. And ultimately, it's ineffective. Another thing is that it actually alters brain development. So when all these experiences within a child, their brain is growing and trying to connect and trying to mature. But when there is trauma, when there is child abuse, their brain is going to change. They may have, because of the stress, more learning problems, but also other areas can be impacted neurologically that we may not see.
Yeah, more prone to depression, to anxiety.
Yes.
The one thing that I think is really obvious but gets missed often is the impact it has on the parent-child relationship. When we're adults, if we were raised in this way, it does leave a lot of work to be done in order for us to be able to build a safe and loving relationship with our parents as adults. And so not everybody is lucky enough to be able to say, I was disciplined in this way and I can now talk to my parents about this. I'm one of the lucky few, and I attribute that to the fact that I'm a therapist, but also to the fact that my parents recognize their mistakes and they feel guilty and they have expressed remorse for, maybe we shouldn't have disciplined you that way. But unfortunately, that's not the case for everybody. And so it definitely creates unnecessary friction for the future.
And so instead of using La Chancla, what can people do instead?
First and foremost, people need to always be open to growing and to becoming informed as parents. Children, we all know, are not born with owner's manuals, and every child is different. Temperaments are different. Personalities are different. So I think every child's needs are different. Because of that, parents need to understand that children are little individuals who have individual needs. And for that reason, the parents need to seek out resources to educate themselves. They can go to parenting groups. Nowadays, we have free parenting groups in the communities.
Yes, for this reason.
Yes, for this reason, exactly. We have hotlines that exist that are of support to parents. We have national and local hotlines for that matter. If any parent does a Google search for parent support hotline, I'm sure they'll find something. Everybody has access to call their local 211 hotline, which will give them resources in their community if they don't know of other ways to reach out to these resources.
And 211 is different in every state. So I'm sure that you probably, if you're in a different state than California, you know what's your information line on your phone. Check that out. They have resources.
Yes. And also socializing with other parents. I recall growing up and my mom getting together with other moms. And then talking about things that they were being stressed out about with raising children. But I think there was a little more hesitation back then. Nowadays, we have these wonderful groups that have formed. Anywhere you go, you hear about the local mommies club,
yes,
or, the local parents club, because we don't want to exclude dads from this as well, right?
That's right.
Nowadays, we have stay-home dads. We have dads that maybe try to invest some time in raising the children to be able to be more balanced and give the wife a break. Maybe the wife also works. And so we want to make sure that also the fathers understand that there's groups that include them. Those are great ways that people can educate themselves and really learn tools to be able to discipline their children in a more effective, healthier, and emotionally safe way, as well as going to counseling.
That's right. Yeah, and there are parenting coaches. There are also, as you mentioned, many therapists that do specialize in this area and are able to help if you feel a little bit of hesitation. Even with short-term counseling, anything will help. And more along the lines of what you were talking about earlier, I think that what your parents did, which was expressing their remorse, that communication is something that is very healing for the recipient of La Chancla. That's something that if you're currently using any, spanking or chancla, any other method, that's something that you can do. If your child is probably age 12 and older, if they're developmentally understanding remorse and your fault, if you can just communicate about how that's wrong on your end and it has really nothing to do with them as an individual, that you've just been stressed out, I think that's also very powerful. It gave you back your voice, Maritza.
Definitely.
And in the moment, so in the heat of the moment, what people can do is just take a step back. So you feel that urge, you feel that frustration that's boiling inside you, that how natural it is for you to just grab something and like impulsively hit the child or whoever. Take a step back, take a big breath first, and then just turn around, leave the scene. You cannot engage when you're in a heated moment like that with anybody. It is not going to be effective. It's not going to be productive. It's really important to just breathe, calm yourself, give your brain more oxygen. And when you're thinking a little bit clearer, when your emotions are a little bit less heightened, then go back and communicate, analyze what just happened and what you can do differently on both ends.
Yes. And just to add one last thing to that, for parents that have suffered trauma, any form of trauma, that find themselves being reactionary and really resorting to using corporal punishment out of their own frustration, get help, seek counseling. I work with trauma, and I cannot tell you the many times that I have heard people in my office talking about, their own trauma has led them to hurt their children and how they really don't intend to do so.
Yeah.
And so I know that over time, getting help and healing from your own traumas can be really helpful in you becoming a more effective parent.
So we are going to merge into the Q&A right now.
Okay.
So we have here, what are the mental health effects of this concept of La Chancla, of the punishment making you into a better person?
For some people, especially people that weren't necessarily affected negatively, it really creates this concept of there's a consequence for every action, right? And it develops a sense of taking responsibility or ownership for your mistakes. When we kind of really take a closer look and see if there's been any impact, any negative impact in their mental health, a lot of the times people that on the outside appear to be doing really well because it actually helped me recognize I deserved it, or this is why I need to behave, or this is why I need to be responsible. A lot of these people actually have turned out to be adults that live with so much anxiety. So what that does is that they can lead very rigid lives, rigid to an extent that really is unnecessary and unhealthy in many ways. That's
so much the norm, right? That's like their normal way of living life. Sometimes you don't recognize that you're living with anxiety because it's been with you for so long, as you're saying, Maritza.
That's my main answer to that question, is that the good side, and I'm saying quote unquote, I know that the listeners can't see that, but the good side of it is that it gives you a sense of recognition, ownership for your mistakes. But the bad side is that it can lead you to become an adult that lives a very anxious, prone life.
The other question that we have here is about child abuse reporting. And just want to say before we answer that this does vary from state to state. But here in California, we can definitely talk about it because we're both licensed here. The question is, when do we report?
In California, we report when the child, or even sometimes the parent themselves, comes in and says the child has been disciplined with an object and there was a mark left, there was an injury as a result of it, or if they report hitting the child in a body part that's not their bottom. So it's not okay, in my experience. I'm saying in my experience because I know this also can vary from, even within California, from county to county. I know that some counties are a little more strict about the child can only be, if you're going to resort to corporal punishment, the child can only be hit on their bottom.
Right. I've heard open hand is okay.
Open hand is okay, not if it leaves a mark So if the red imprint of the hand is left on the bottom, that is considered an injury. That is considered leaving a mark. And that means you hit too hard. And that means that is reportable as an incident of child abuse.
And so this is legal for all mandated reporters, police officers, teachers, therapists. But if you are not a mandated reporter, when should you report an abuse?
Anybody. And I want to make sure that anybody listening understands that your local child abuse hotline is really available for anyone who wants to call. People can call anonymously and just consult and ask questions. You don't necessarily have to give any information. You can call anytime. They're available 24 hours, 7 days a week, where someone can answer questions about if I do this with my child, or if a child gets disciplined in this way, is this considered child abuse? And that can help you determine whether or not you want to go forward and ask for help if you're calling for yourself, or if you're calling because you're witnessing this being done to a child, whether it be a neighbor or a family friend that is disciplining their child in this way. One of the things that I like to point out to people who come to me and kind of do this approach of, I don't want to really tell you any information, I just want to ask in general, is that I encourage them to call, and I tell them, a lot of the times parents resort to this because they don't know any better, because they don't have other tools. They're not educated in how to help their child with the behavior. And so a lot of the times reaching out to child protective services can actually have a very positive impact for the parent and the child, because then child protective services, it's not like it used to be before where they would come in and they would just take the child, remove the child. They can't possibly do that for every call that they get. Can you imagine? Where would they put these children? What they do is, for the most part, they come in, they investigate, they talk to the parents, they talk to the children, and they create a safety plan for the family. They create a plan that is, for example, going to counseling, going to parenting classes. There's now a lot of these wraparound programs where they actually send providers into the home to help the parents with the children. Sometimes the children have unidentified disabilities, whether it be learning or developmental disabilities that are taking place that are maybe causing the behavior that's so frustrating to the parents. And this is the only way that the parents are able to identify this, because you get the professionals, the service providers into the home to observe the children in their natural environment. And then they say, wait a minute, this is actually something that is happening because of a learning or a developmental disability that we need to maybe bring in additional services for. And then all of a sudden, everybody is doing a lot better. The child is getting the help they need. The parent is feeling less stressed, more supported. The parent is having someone to talk to that really understands. And the parent all of a sudden has all of these resources available to them. So that's why if the thought crosses your mind, you should be calling just to ask information. And then if you feel that you want to see what resources are available, maybe inviting someone into the home. I've had so many parents that have called with me because they trusted that this is the way that it was going to go for them after I educated them. And sure enough, this is how they worked out for them.
Yeah. So many of my Latinx clients where I've needed to make a phone call, they've done it themselves. And for those that have received services in the home, I want to say I've been very pleased with the services. Sometimes not so much with specific people, but overall with the services, they have been happy with them. So it's definitely beneficial to do this. And look, I just want to be real with everyone. If your child comes home to you and tells you that Susie is being hit and your child saw a mark, if anything else is happening to a child and you're afraid because you don't want to get involved, you want to say, their family's going to deal with it, I'm going to suggest that you take the lead and you actually make the call. You become the example for your child, and we stop this cycle of keeping it within the families. We do it. We help another child out by making this anonymous call if you're not in the field.
Yeah. And it kind of goes full circle with the way it used to be back in the days where it took a village to raise a child. But this is a more healthy way to do so.
Yes, definitely. And so this next question we actually answered from Carlita. Can you discuss why fear of a parent through threats of corporal punishment doesn't work long-term for children when making life choices, deciding right from wrong, following their inner voice? Maritza said that children are stripped from their voice and the identity becomes an issue. Identity issues are caused from corporal punishment, from la chancla, etc. So all this leads into the effects of creating that anxiety of your own within your own choices and following your own voice because you've had to obey for years someone else and you cannot identify with your own self. And so the last question.
How is abuse normalized in our culture?
Yes.
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that we see it as an act of love.
Yeah.
We see it as something that we do in order to make sure our family is taken care of. Everybody's needs are taken care of. For example, if the children are fighting, whoever is the instigator of that fight or the one, the kid who hit first, that kid is being disciplined because they need to learn to respect, but also it's taking care of the need of the other child to see that justice was done for them. Yeah. So in the same way, it ensures that the parent feels like they did the parenting. If you look at it from all of those angles, then we can say this is how it's normalized in our culture as something that is actually about family, about love. Mm-hmm. And in reality, like you said earlier, violence is not really love.
There's no place in love for violence at all.
Can I add one more thing? I think that it's normalized a lot through the way that we make fun about it in social media, even in, movies or I love stand-up comedy. And I noticed this is a common topic for Mexican stand-up comedians. It's really funny to talk about when your parents use the chancla or when you grew up using la chancla. And I think it gives off, while they may be talking about it to present a very important topic, and bring light to the fact that it's not necessarily the best thing to use. I think from a lot of people, they miss the point. Mm-hmm. It's because it's presented in such a platform that's not taken so seriously. I think in that context, does away with the purpose of why it's even being brought up. Mm-hmm. And again, also in novelas, I grew up watching novelas where, the women would slap the guy for looking at another woman or talking to another woman. And again, it just kind of, as a kid, I remember thinking, oh, this is the way of being as adults, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think we normalize violence through the things we expose our children to and the things that we expose ourselves to.
Yeah, and the way that we talk about it. So it's really important for us to shift our thoughts about la chancla for the sake of the newer generation that we're raising for our future. Yeah, so that the cycle can ultimately just pause, can stop, can be broken.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Maritza. This was such a heavy topic. What are you going to do to take care of yourself after this conversation?
I was thinking about the way that I take care of myself, and typically that is by listening to music. Mm-hmm. We used to also have times when my mom would just play music and dance with all of the kids, and that's how we would have fun. Because my nephews are not necessarily into that, I think what I'm going to do after this, I'm going to actually drive over to my mom's house where my 6-year-old nephew is. Okay. And I'm going to go play a board game with him.
Okay, I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. Here are the resources as promised. So here we have www.childhelp.org, which is a non-profit that is dedicated to helping victims of child abuse and neglect. I also want to provide you all with www.childwelfare.gov, and this website is specifically for educational resources. the last resource I will provide is the National Parent Hotline, which is 1-855-427-2736. I'm going to mention one book actually. The Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel. We actually highly recommend. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Follow Maritza on Instagram at MindfulQuestRC and also on Facebook at Mindful Quest Relationship Counseling. All right, tune in next week.